Welcome to the True Crimes Unfold compilation video series. Please note that events and scenarios in this video may be graphic for some viewers. Discretion is advised. Details of the videos are taken from actual case files. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what type of cases you'd like us to cover next, and we'll make sure to add them to our list. Don't forget to subscribe to get new stories as soon as they're released. Abound. Now settle in, get ready, and let's begin. Let me tell you about a house in Jacksonville. Not the kind that makes headlines right away. Just a modest place with peeling paint and crooked shutters. The kind of home that makes you cross the street without knowing exactly why. The summer of 2015 was particularly brutal there. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and reality bend. That's when they found her, or rather parts of her, buried in the backyard of 1915 Cassat Avenue. Johnny Gunter, age 30, had been missing for months, but she wasn't alone down there. Not by far. But to understand the horror of what happened to Johnny and the others, we need to go back. Back to 1987, when a nurse named Terry met a patient who came asking about tattoo removal. He had beautiful hands, she'd later recall. Elegant, well-maintained hands that would eventually wrap around her throat. Russell Tellis wasn't born a monster. At least, that's what the court psychiatrists would claim. In the trailer behind his childhood home, young Russell and his brother learned early lessons about pain from their father. Lessons that would echo through decades and claim dozens of victims. The neighbors noticed things, of course. The late-night screams they convinced themselves were cats fighting. The women who entered the house but weren't seen leaving. The terrible mechanical sounds from the backyard at 3 a.m. They filed complaints, 83 of them, each one a desperate plea that something wasn't right at the Tellis house. But Russell was clever. Each time police came, he'd greet them with those beautiful hands and that disarming smile. Just a misunderstanding, he'd say. And they'd leave, never noticing the fresh dirt in his yard or the faint scratching sounds coming from below. Terry noticed things too, in the beginning. The way Russell's smile never quite reached his eyes. How he'd stare too long at women on the street. The strange gifts he'd bring home. Jewelry that seemed worn. Diaries with torn-out pages. But by then, she wore his ring and carried his child. And in Russell's world, leaving wasn't an option. I was working the case back then, gathering missing persons reports that all seemed to lead nowhere. Until that night in May, when we decided to set a trap. We didn't know then that Russell had already set his own. Literal traps, razor blades and nails scattered across his yard to keep his secrets buried. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Johnny Gunter's last night alive. About the moment she realized the charming man offering her a ride wasn't taking her home. About the house that devoured souls. And the monster who wore a smile like a mask. You see, the most terrifying thing about Russell Tellis wasn't the violence. It was how normal he seemed. How he could chat with neighbors, shop for groceries, even attend church, all while his basement held unspeakable horrors. The story I'm about to tell you. Well, let's just say there's a reason I still check my locks 3 times before bed. because monsters don't hide under beds anymore. Sometimes they live next door with beautiful hands and empty eyes, waiting to invite you in. You know what's strange about evil? How it seeps into walls, into foundations. The Tellis house knew darkness long before Russell made it his playground. Those same rooms had witnessed his own childhood torments. A father's drunken rage, a mother's desperate attempt to protect her sons by banishing them to the backyard trailer. Terry discovered this truth slowly, like poison dripping into a clean well. The first signs were small: missing jewelry, unexplained absences. But then came that night in February when she woke to find Russell standing over their bed, studying her sleeping form with those beautiful, terrible hands, clenching and unclenching in the moonlight. "Just watching you breathe," he'd said, smiling that empty smile. The neighbors' dogs were the first to sense something wrong. One by one, they stopped barking at night, not out of peace, but terror. Mrs. Davidson at number 1917 told me how her German shepherd, a former police dog, would whimper and hide whenever Russell walked past. Animals know things we've forgotten how to know. Then came the modifications to the house. The tall fences went up first, topped with razor wire that gleamed like teeth in the Florida sun. Security cameras appeared, their red eyes blinking in the darkness. But they weren't pointing out at potential intruders. They were aimed inward, at the house itself. Terry learned to sleep through the sounds from the basement, the whirring, the muffled thumps, the occasional scream that Russell insisted was just the old water heater. But it was the laughter that haunted her most. How he would sit in his favorite chair, flipping through photographs only he could see, chuckling softly to himself. The neighbors started noticing things missing. Small things at first: garden tools, extension cords, car batteries. Then Miss Thompson's daughter mentioned seeing Russell late one night, dragging something heavy wrapped in plastic into his garage. When questioned, he said it was just old carpeting. The dark stains, he explained, were from water damage. But it was the Christmas party of '89 that should have warned us all. Russell, uncharacteristically social, invited the entire neighborhood. Only 3 families came, but those who did noticed strange things, like how he'd installed heavy locks on the outside of interior doors, how the basement door was reinforced with steel, how he kept glancing at his watch, as if waiting for something. Terry found the hidden room by accident while cleaning, behind the water heater, a door sealed with multiple locks. When she asked Russell about it, he flew into a rage so terrible she grabbed their daughter and ran. But where do you run when the monster holds all the keys? The police reports started piling up. Women vanishing from nearby truck stops. Prostitutes last seen getting into a car that matched Russell's. But he was careful. So careful. Always with an alibi. Always with those clean, manicured hands ready to help the officers fill out their reports. I remember interviewing Terry after she finally escaped. "The worst part," she whispered, "wasn't the violence. It was watching someone you love turn into something else, something hungry." But we still hadn't found the tunnel system, hadn't discovered why the electric bills for that modest house were higher than a factory's, hadn't understood why Russell spent so much time gardening at night. That would all come later, after Johnny Gunter made the mistake of trusting those beautiful hands. They say evil has a smell. In the summer of 2015, the neighbors finally understood what that meant. The odor began subtly, something like copper and wet earth after rain. But as the Florida heat intensified, so did the stench. Even the flies seemed different around the teller's house. Bigger, darker, as if fed on something unspeakable. I remember the day we first entered what the media would later call the Devil's Workshop. The neighbors had called about that smell. Complaint number 83. But this time was different. This time, we had a warrant. The front of the house maintained its facade of normalcy. Family photos on walls, dishes in the sink, a TV guide open to that evening's programs. But there were inconsistencies, like how every mirror was covered with black cloth, how the kitchen knives were arranged by size, their blades gleaming with an attention that spoke of obsession rather than cleanliness. The basement door had 13 locks. We counted them, each one more elaborate than the last, but it was the smell that hit us first. A wall of decay, so thick it felt physical. Officer Martinez vomited. I wish I had too. What we found down there would haunt my dreams for years to come. The main room was organized. That's what struck me most. Everything labeled, catalogued, tools arranged with surgical precision, video equipment set up in corners, and the walls. God, the walls. They were covered in Polaroids. Hundreds of them. Each one showing a different woman. Some smiling, some terrified, some. Behind the water heater, we found the first hidden door. Then another. And another. Russell had created a maze beneath his house. Rooms within rooms, each with its own purpose, each with its own horrors. The electricity bills suddenly made sense. He'd been running industrial freezers down there, preserving things, collecting them. But it was room 7 that broke me. A perfectly normal bedroom, like something from a furniture catalog. Floral wallpaper, a neatly made bed, even a teddy bear propped against the pillows. Everything pristine, untouched, waiting. We later learned from his journals that this room was meant for Terry, his endgame, his masterpiece that never came to be. The neighbors began coming forward then. Mrs. Davidson recalled the night she saw Russell dragging heavy garbage bags to his car at 3 a.m. Mr. Thompson remembered the sounds of digging in the backyard during storms, when the thunder would mask other noises. And little Tommy from next door told us about the day he lost his ball over Russell's fence and saw the sleeping ladies in the garden. We found Johnny Gunter's remains exactly where Tommy had seen. Those sleeping ladies, but she wasn't alone. The ground-penetrating radar revealed the truth. Russell's garden wasn't just a garden. It was a graveyard. Each flower bed marked a victim. He'd been planting roses over them, one for each life he took. The roses were blood red and unnaturally large, but the true horror wasn't in the tools, the rooms, or even the graves. It was in Russell's journals, dozens of them, meticulously kept. He wrote about his victims like a wine connoisseur describing vintages. Their fears, their pleas, their final moments, all documented with those beautiful, steady hands. One entry stands out. The night Johnny Gunter arrived. She notices things, he wrote, the way the others didn't. She saw the truth behind my smile. For that, she'll get special treatment. After all, every rose garden needs fertilizer. But we still hadn't found the worst room. The one behind the freezers. The one where Russell kept his works in progress. You see, some of his victims were still alive when we raided the house, still breathing in those numbered rooms, waiting for their turn in the garden. There's something about dawn in Florida, the way darkness reluctantly peels back, like lifting a scab. That's when we moved in on Russell's house, May 28th, 2015. The morning dew was still fresh on those blood-red roses when our tactical team took position. We'd been watching him for days. Russell had developed routines, predictable patterns. Every morning at 6:17, he'd check his mailbox, then walk the perimeter of his property. Always clockwise, always 13 steps between pauses. But this morning was different. He knew something was wrong. The first officer went down before we even reached the front door. Not shot, trapped. Russell had turned his entire yard into a maze of buried razors and nail boards. Even his garden paths were rigged. Later, we learned he'd mapped it all out in one of his journals. A spider's web, and he was the spider. Inside, the house fought back. Every door was booby-trapped. Every hallway rigged with tripwires. But it was the recordings that got to us most. Speakers hidden in the walls played sounds of women screaming, crying, begging. We couldn't tell which were real and which were recordings. That was the point, we realized later. Pure psychological warfare. The first survivor we found was barely alive, hidden behind a false wall in the kitchen, a space so small it defied belief. She'd been there for 3 months. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, reported missing from a truck stop in Georgia. When we found her, she was scratching at the wall with bloodied fingers. Not trying to get out, she told us later. She was trying to scratch a message for the next girl. He never sleeps. But Russell had vanished. While we cleared the house room by room, he was moving through his tunnel system, a network of narrow passages he dug beneath the neighborhood. Some led to storm drains, others to abandoned buildings. One even connected to the old bomb shelter under the elementary school 3 blocks away. In the basement, each room told a story. Room 1, photography, where he documented their arrival. Room 2, the breaking room, tools laid out like surgical instruments. Room 3, the trophy room, where he kept their belongings arranged by date. Each room more horrific than the last. Then we found Room X, unmarked on his maps. A metal door, sealed with a handprint scanner. Inside, a command center. Monitors showing feeds from cameras hidden all over the neighborhood. Files on potential victims. Surveillance photos, daily routines, all meticulously documented. He'd been hunting for years, cataloging his prey like a naturalist. The survivors' testimonies painted a picture worse than our darkest assumptions. Russell didn't just kill. He collected, studied, experimented. Some victims he kept alive for months, testing their limits, breaking them down piece by piece. He filmed everything, narrating like a professor giving a lecture. We found him finally, in the last place we expected, his mother's grave. He dug a bunker beneath her headstone years ago. When we cornered him, those beautiful hands were still clean, nails perfectly manicured. He smiled that empty smile and said only one thing. "Did you water my roses?" But it was what we found on his person that chilled us most. A fresh Polaroid, taken that morning. A woman we hadn't found yet. In the photo, she was still alive, holding that day's newspaper. The hunt wasn't over. You see, Russell hadn't been working alone. Those tunnel systems, Those elaborate traps, it was too much for one person. And those clean hands of his, someone else had to do the dirty work. Someone we hadn't got yet. Someone who might be listening to this very story. Every horror story has an ending, but some endings are just new beginnings. The woman in Russell's final Polaroid. We found her. But I sometimes wish we hadn't. What we discovered in that bomb shelter beneath the school changed everything we thought we knew about Russell Tellis. Her name was Angela Winters. Unlike the others, she wasn't a random target. She was a journalist investigating cold cases in Jacksonville. She'd gotten too close to something. Not just Russell's crimes, but something bigger. Something that reached into the darkest corners of the city's history. In Angela's research files, we found connections. Other houses, other gardens, other men with beautiful, clean hands. Russell wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a pattern. Every 20 years since 1935, Jacksonville had seen a spike in missing persons cases. Each time centered around a different house. Each time involving men who smiled empty smiles. The trial was a maze of its own. Russell spoke only once when asked about his motives. "You still don't see it, do you?" he whispered. "The house chose me, just like it chose the others, just like it's choosing someone right now." We found Terry living in Seattle under a new name. When we told her about Russell's capture, she didn't seem relieved. Instead, she asked about the house. Was it still standing? Had we burned it down? When we said no, she started crying. "Then it's not over," she said. "It's never over." The evidence room holding Russell's belongings burned down 3 days after his conviction. The fire marshal called it electrical, but I saw the security footage. Someone with beautiful, clean hands had visited just hours before. Someone who moved like Russell, smiled like Russell. They demolished the house in 2017. The ground where it stood remains empty. Nothing will grow there, not even weeds. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing lights moving beneath the soil. And those roses, they keep coming back, blood red and impossibly large, no matter how many times they're pulled up. Russell died in prison last year. Heart attack, they said. But his last visitor reported his final words. "The house is calling. Another set of hands has answered." 2 days ago, a real estate listing appeared online. A modest home for sale in Jacksonville. The photos show peeling paint, crooked shutters, and in one window, just barely visible, a reflection of hands. Beautiful, clean hands beckoning. They say evil has a smell. But what they don't tell you is that evil also has a home. And sometimes it's looking for new tenants. Sleep well tonight, friends. And if you're house hunting in Jacksonville, maybe skip the fixer-uppers. Let me tell you about the suitcase they found in Iowa. The same suitcase a young woman had packed with hopes and dreams just days earlier. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The heat in Iowa City that September was oppressive, the kind that makes the air shimmer and reality bend. That's how Officer Martinez described it. The way the heat waves rose from the asphalt of that parking lot, distorting the shape of an ordinary Toyota Corolla that had sat there, untouched, for far too long. The smell came first. In this line of work, you never forget that smell. Martinez approached the vehicle, noting the fine layer of dust that had settled on its surface. except for one area on the trunk lid where something had recently dragged across it. But to understand the horror of what they found in that trunk, we need to go back. Back to Dalian, China, where a little girl named Xiao Tong was born in 1994 to parents who dreamed of sending their daughter to America. They saved every yuan they could, tucking away money in an old cookie tin, building their daughter's future one sacrifice at a time. They didn't know then that every dollar they saved was buying their daughter's one-way ticket to her own murder. Xiao was brilliant, top of her class, beloved by teachers, the kind of student American universities dream about. But it was her smile that everyone remembered. The kind of smile that lights up a room and sometimes attracts the wrong kind of attention. That's where he enters our story, Li Xiangnan. Even now, years later, her friends still talk about his eyes, how they would follow Xiao across rooms, how they never seemed to blink, how they turned from adoring to possessive so slowly that no one noticed until it was too late. They came to Iowa together in 2012, her to study chemical engineering at the University of Iowa, him to study economics nearby. Young love, everyone said. But love isn't supposed to leave bruises on your soul. It's not supposed to track your every movement, count your every friend, measure your every smile. I interviewed her roommates after what happened. They told me about the strange little things. How Xiao stopped video calling her parents. How her laughter became quieter, then disappeared entirely. How Li would stand outside their apartment at night, just watching. But the detail that haunts me most, the text messages. In the final days, Xiao's best friend received messages from her phone. Messages talking about a spontaneous trip to Minnesota. But Xiao had never been spontaneous in her life. Every decision was carefully planned, every move calculated. Her friend said the messages felt wrong, like someone else was wearing Xiao's words like an ill-fitting mask. That hotel room, though, that's where everything changed. Room 217, at the extended stay on the outskirts of town. But I'm not ready to tell you about what they found behind the headboard. Not yet. Some horrors need to be approached slowly, like a darkness you have to let your eyes adjust to. What I can tell you is this. When they finally opened that trunk in the September heat, they found more than just a body in a suitcase. They found an American dream twisted into an American nightmare. They found the price of trust, measured in the weight of a young woman's final moments. You know what they say about jealousy, how it grows like mold in dark places. Room 217 at the extended stay had plenty of dark places. But I'm still not ready to tell you what happened there. First, you need to understand how Li turned love into a prison, one locked door at a time. The signs were there from the beginning. Little things. The way he'd show up unannounced at her chemistry labs. How he'd count the male names in her phone. The way he gave her apartment address as his own. Every piece of mail, every package, every ticket becoming another link in an invisible chain. Her roommate Angela told me something interesting during the investigation. Said she'd wake up at night to find Li sitting in their dark living room, just waiting. When asked why he was there, he'd smile that empty smile and say he was protecting Xiao. From what, he never said. But it was the cameras that really got to me. We found them later. Tiny things, barely bigger than buttons, hidden in gifts he'd given her. A teddy bear with glass eyes that saw too much. a desk clock that watched her study, a phone charger that recorded every conversation. The Chinese student community noticed things too. How Xiao stopped coming to their gatherings, how she'd check her phone every 3 minutes, exactly 3 minutes, as if she was being timed. How she'd flinch when it buzzed, not from fear, they said, but from certainty. The certainty of knowing who it was, always knowing. In April 2014, 5 months before the end, Xiao's mother called the police. Not to report a crime. No, nothing so concrete. She called because her daughter had stopped smiling during their video chats. Because Xiao, who'd always been a waterfall of words, had become a desert of silence. But what crime do you report when the only evidence is a daughter's fading light? The hotel receipts tell a story of their own. Every weekend, like clockwork, always the same room, always paid in cash. To the desk clerk, they look like any other young couple. But young couples don't usually bring bleach and trash bags on romantic getaways. We found his browser history later. Searches that would make your skin crawl. How long before a missing person is reported? Decomposition rates in summer. China-US extradition treaty. Can police track deleted messages? But it was the photographs that truly showed his descent. In each one, taken over months without her knowledge, Zhao appears smaller, as if Li's lens was somehow consuming her, bite by digital bite. The last photo, taken 3 days before she disappeared, shows only her shadow. The weekend of September 5th arrived like any other. Xiao packed her suitcase, the same suitcase that would later. But we're not there yet. Li booked room 217 again. The desk clerk remembers them checking in. Remembers Li's unusual request for extra towels. Remember how Xiao wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Her last real text message, not the ones Li would later send pretending to be her, was to her best friend. Sometimes I think he sees me even when I'm alone. She wasn't wrong. In Li's apartment, we found journals, hundreds of pages documenting every minute of Xiao's day. What she ate, who she talked to, how many times she smiled at others. The final entry, dated September 6th, reads simply, "She's starting to understand. I can't let her leave. Now I can tell you about room 217. About what they found behind that headboard. About why the cleaning staff still refuses to enter that room alone. But first, pour yourself another drink. You're going to need it. Room 217 looked ordinary enough. That's what haunts me most. The floral wallpaper, faded from years of sunlight. The generic landscape painting above the bed. The small desk where Xiao would never finish her chemistry homework. How can something so mundane become a crime scene? The cleaning staff noticed first. Not what happened, but what didn't happen. No calls for fresh towels, no room service trays. Complete silence for 48 hours. In a hotel where every thin wall usually tells the story, room 217 kept its secrets. September 6th, 2:17 a.m. The night manager remembers hearing what she thought was furniture being moved. Later, security footage would show Li making 3 trips to his car between 2 a.m. and dawn, each time carrying garbage bags, each time returning empty-handed. But it was behind the headboard where they found the first real evidence. You see, these budget hotels, they don't move the furniture to clean. Years of dust had collected there. Dust and other things. DNA doesn't lie. Neither does blood spatter analysis. The story it told was brutal. How he'd waited until she was asleep. How the first blow came from behind. A coward's attack. How she'd fought back. Her broken fingernails embedded in the wallpaper tell us that much. But Lee had planned too well. The towels he'd requested muffled her screams. They found her phone wedged under the radiator. The screen cracked, but still receiving his messages. Messages he sent to himself, pretending to be her. Building his alibi even as he... But I'm getting ahead of myself. The hotel's security cameras caught something else. Something the investigators almost missed. In every frame, showing Lee leaving with those garbage bags, there's a shadow in the second floor window. Room 217. A figure watching. But here's the thing. Lee was the one carrying the bags. When they finally processed the room, they found his preparations were meticulous. Plastic sheeting under the carpet. Cleaning supplies hidden in the air conditioning vent. A handwritten checklist in his precise handwriting. 3 a.m. End it. 3:30 a.m. Clean. 4 a.m. Messages. 5 a.m. Disposal. 6 a.m. Become a ghost. But Lee made mistakes, the kind of mistakes that only obsession can cause. He kept trophies, her student ID hidden in his wallet, a lock of her hair carefully preserved in his journal, and most damning of all, a video. A video showing room 217 on September 5th. Showing Xiao, alive, reading that day's newspaper. His proof of life that would become evidence of premeditation. The suitcase, her suitcase, was his final mistake. The same one she'd packed with dreams of Minnesota. He didn't realize that expensive luggage has serial numbers. Numbers that can be traced. Numbers that led police to that parking lot where the heat made reality shimmer. But there's something else about room 217. Something the night manager mentioned that still makes my skin crawl. Even now, years later, guests report strange phenomena. Text messages sent from disconnected phones. The sound of furniture moving at 2:17 a.m. And sometimes, in the right light, a shadow in the window. Watching. Always watching. Would you like to know the worst part? The detail that keeps me awake at night? According to hotel records, Lee had been booking room 217 every weekend for 3 months before that final stay. Each time bringing cleaning supplies. Each time rehearsing. Each time waiting. Ever notice how evidence has a way of whispering? Like breadcrumbs leading not home, but deeper into darkness. Lee's digital footprint told its own horror story, one bite at a time. His laptop revealed an obsession turned to methodology. Firefox. How long does a body take to? Chrome. Best places to dispose. Safari. China criminal extradition laws. 3 different browsers. 3 different deletion patterns. 1 dark purpose. But it was his cloud storage that truly showed the depths. Thousands of photos of Xiao. Sleeping, studying, smiling with friends, their faces methodically scratched out in each image. A digital shrine built by a digital stalker. Most disturbing were the folders labeled by date. September 7th was empty. The investigation spread like ripples in dark water. First Iowa City Police, then the State Bureau, finally Interpol. Because Lee had vanished. A ghost following his own checklist, but he left traces. Always traces. Credit card records showed a pattern. September 7th, 4:13 a.m. Gas station purchase. 5:22 a.m. More gas, different station. 6:45 a.m. Cleaning supplies. 7:30 a.m. One-way ticket to Shanghai. But here's what keeps me awake. Between those purchases, cell tower pings placed his phone near 3 different rivers, each shallow enough to wade into, each deep enough to hide secrets, each still holding their mysteries. The Chinese police were surprisingly cooperative, maybe because the victim was one of their own, maybe because the evidence was too damning to ignore. They found Li in his grandmother's house in Wenzhou, still wearing the watch Xiao had given him, still checking her social media accounts. The interrogation footage is disturbing. The 26 hours of Li, speaking in this eerily calm voice about Xiao in the present tense, as if she was still alive, as if room 217 were just another weekend getaway. Until they showed him the headboard evidence. That's when his facade cracked. Not with guilt or remorse, but with pride. He described everything. The planning, the execution, the cleanup. Like he was presenting a thesis. His masterpiece, he called it. His magnum opus of possession. But he slipped up. Started talking about the others. About how Xiao wasn't the first girl he'd followed, photographed, studied. The investigators found more folders in his cloud storage, more names, more faces, more empty folders with future dates. The hotel's surveillance footage held one final secret. In the frames from 3 a.m., there's a moment when Li looks directly at the camera. Smiles, waves. He wanted to be seen. I wanted his work appreciated. Like all artists, he craved an audience. They found his journal, hidden in the grandmother's attic. The last entry reads, "They'll never understand. Love isn't about having. It's about making sure no one else can have what's yours. Now Xiao is mine forever, and soon others will be too." The Chinese authorities moved quickly after that, but there's something they never found. Something that still bothers those of us who work the case. Li's phone contained a video from room 217, time-stamped 2:16 a.m. 1 minute before, everything. In it, Xiao is speaking directly to the camera. "If you're watching this, I'm probably already..." The video cuts off there. To this day, no one knows what she was trying to tell us. Sometimes the most terrifying part of a horror story isn't the ending. It's the echoes that follow, the ripples that never quite fade. Let me tell you about what they found in Li's grandmother's attic, and why room 217 remains empty to this day. The trial in China lasted 3 days. Just 3 days to dissect 2 years of obsession. But it was the evidence they didn't present that haunts me most. The things deemed too disturbing for public record. Remember those 3 rivers I mentioned? They dragged them all. Found nothing, but in each location, precisely arranged on the riverbank, fresh flowers, red roses, still being delivered. Weekly, even now, but Li's been in prison for years. The grandmother's attic held more than just that journal. Hidden in the walls, they found a shrine. Photos of Xiao, yes, but also letters. Hundreds of them. Written by Li, addressed to future victims. Each envelope dated. The last one marked 2025. But here's what broke the case wide open. Li's computer contained a folder labeled Tutorial. Inside, a document titled The Perfect Love Story, detailing step-by-step instructions for stalking, isolating, and preserving love. It had been downloaded 47 times before police found it. The hotel management finally demolished room 217 last year. Too many complaints. Too many inexplicable phenomena. The night manager told me they kept finding things behind that headboard. Things that couldn't possibly be there. Polaroid photos, fresh ones, of empty rooms. Lee's prison interviews reveal something even more disturbing. He speaks of Xiao in the present tense, claims she visits him nightly, says she's happier now, preserved forever in his memory, never aging, never leaving. The psychiatrists say he's delusional. But then, how do they explain the fresh flowers in his cell every morning? Xiao's parents installed a security camera at her grave in China. Every morning, the footage shows the same thing. 2:17 a.m., static interference, then fresh flowers. No visitor visible. The timestamp never changes. Always 2:17. Last week, I received a package. Inside, a USB drive containing a single video file. The metadata shows it was created 3 days ago. It shows room 217, not as it is now, demolished and empty, but as it was that night. And there, in the corner, a figure sitting in the dark, watching, waiting, planning. But here's the detail that makes my blood run cold. The desk clerk who checked them on that final night, she swears there was something odd about Lee's reflection in the lobby mirror. Something is missing. And in every security photo from that weekend, his shadow falls wrong, as if it belongs to someone else. Lee will be eligible for parole in 2040. His grandmother's house remains empty, but neighbors report seeing lights in the attic. And that laptop, sealed in an evidence locker, sometimes the guards hear it boot up, all by itself, always at 2:17 a.m. They say love can transcend death, but some kinds of love create death. And sometimes, if you book room 217 in any hotel, anywhere in the world, you might receive a courtesy call at 2:17 a.m., a soft voice asking if you'd like fresh towels. I'd suggest not answering. Gather around, friends. The fire's getting low, and I've got a story that'll make you question everything you know about family bonds. It's about the darkest kind of betrayal, the kind that comes from someone you've given everything to. December 10th, 2021. It was one of those bright, cheerful Philippine mornings that gave no hint of the horror to come. The kind where sunshine streams through windows in golden ribbons, and the air carries the sweet scent of breakfast being prepared in countless homes. But in one particular house, in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, a teenage girl was about to shatter the perfect illusion she'd helped create. Picture this. Cruz Maguad, a respected elementary school teacher, kisses his wife Illa goodbye as they head to work. Their adopted daughter, Janice, calls them mom and dad for the first time that morning, their hearts soar with joy, unaware that these words are not a milestone of love, but a signal for something far more sinister. Let me take you back 3 months earlier, when the Magwad household was the very picture of familial bliss. Cruz and Illa, their 2 biological children, 16-year-old Louis and 18-year-old Gwen, and the newly adopted daughter, 17-year-old Janice. They lived in a modest home with a small pig farm out back, the kind of place where family photos lined the walls and the smell of home-cooked meals filled the air every evening. But if you looked closer, if you paid attention to the shadows in the corners of those family photos, you'd see something wasn't quite right. In every picture, Janice's eyes held a peculiar gleam. When Gwen and Louis received praise from their parents, the adopted girl's smile never quite reached those eyes. She'd stand in doorways, watching the family interact, her head tilted slightly, like a predator studying its prey. There were signs, of course. There always are, like the time Cruise's emergency fund of some $200 vanished, only to be found hidden in a secret compartment in Janice's backpack. The family chose to see it as a cry for help from a traumatized child. They didn't realize it was just a test, a small experiment to see how far their forgiveness would stretch. Janice's background was a tapestry of tragedy, or so everyone thought. Found alone on a cargo ship at age 8, bouncing between homes as a live-in maid, never knowing the stability of a real family. The Magwads thought they were writing a new chapter in her story. They didn't know they were actually reading from a script she had carefully crafted. In those 3 months, Janice became the perfect daughter. She helped with chores without being asked. She studied with Gwen, laughed at Louis' jokes, and seemed to bloom under the warmth of the Magwad's love. But at night, when the house was quiet, she would sit at her window, scrolling through her phone, messaging someone named Marlin. Their conversations, had anyone seen them, would have frozen the blood in their veins. 7 souls, one message read. God will forgive me if I repent. The timestamp showed 3 a.m., while the family slept peacefully, unaware of the darkness brewing under their roof. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, what makes this story truly terrifying isn't just what Janice did. It's how perfectly she played her role. How she made the Magwads believe they were saving her, when all along she was plotting their destruction. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, she didn't just wear the disguise. She lived it, breathed it, made everyone believe it was real. That bright December morning, when she finally called them Mom and Dad, wasn't the beginning of a new chapter. It was the end of the story she'd let them believe, and the start of a nightmare none of them saw coming. But before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen nothing looking back? Because that's what Illa Magwad would later say about Janice. Not anger, not hatred, just a void where a soul should be. You know what's fascinating about darkness? It doesn't always come all at once. Sometimes it creeps in so slowly, you don't notice until it's too late. That's how it was with Janice. Let me tell you about the weeks leading up to that fatal December morning. Remember that cargo ship I mentioned? The one where 8-year-old Janice was found? Well, here's something the adoption papers didn't show. She wasn't lost. She wasn't abandoned. She was waiting. Even then, she knew how to play the part of the helpless child. The social workers who found her described a small girl with tear-stained cheeks, clutching a worn teddy bear, the perfect picture of innocence. But there was another side to Janice's story, one that lived in the shadows of her social media accounts, where she maintained contact with her very much alive biological mother, Michelle. You see, while the Magwads thought they were giving an orphan a second chance, Janice was orchestrating an elaborate performance. In her private messages with Marlin, a troubled church maintenance boy she'd met through mutual acquaintances, Janice's true nature began to surface. They treat me like charity, one message read. Even their love feels like pity. Each message grew darker, more twisted, like watching poison spread through clear water. Let me tell you about a particular night in November, just weeks before the tragedy. Gwen, the eldest Magwat child, woke up around midnight to get a glass of water. As she passed Janice's room, she heard whispering. Through the crack in the door, she saw her adopted sister standing in front of her mirror, practicing something over and over. "Mom, Dad," Janice whispered, tears streaming down her face. But when she wiped them away, Gwen saw something that would haunt her until her final day. A smile. Not the warm, gentle smile they'd grown used to, but something else. Something hollow. The Magwad house itself seemed to sense the growing darkness. Things began to disappear. Small things at first. A kitchen knife here, a baseball bat there. Cruz's antique hammer vanished from his toolbox. When questioned, Janice would help search for hours, offering comforting words and suggestions. No one thought to check the false bottom she'd crafted in her closet. But the most chilling part? The practice runs. Security cameras from neighboring houses would later show Janice testing different routes to and from the house, timing herself, studying the family's routines. She knew exactly when Cruz would be teaching his favorite class, when Illa would be tied up in administrative meetings. The relationship with Marlin deepened during this time. They would meet in the church after hours, their whispered conversations echoing in the empty sanctuary. Marlin, with his own troubled past and growing obsession with Janice, became her willing apprentice. Together, they planned what Janice called her purification, the elimination of everything standing between her and complete possession of the Magwad family's love and resources. In her diary, later found hidden in a hollow Bible, Janice had written something particularly disturbing. 7 souls stand between me and peace. God forgives those who repent, but first, the sacrifice must be made. The pages that followed contained detailed drawings of the house's layout, marked with red X's and timestamps. December arrived like a wolf in sheep's clothing, bringing with it the cheerful buzz of holiday preparations. The Magwads, planning their first Christmas as a complete family, filled the house with decorations and joy. Janice helped bake cookies, hung stockings, and even asked to say grace at dinner. Her performance was flawless. But in the dead of night, when the house slept, she would slip out of bed and practice. Practice walking silently down the hallway. Practice opening doors without a sound. Practice other things. The security camera in the kitchen caught her one night, standing motionless for hours, just staring at the knife block. As December 10th approached, there was one final piece to her puzzle. That morning, when she called Cruz and Illa mom and dad for the first time, it wasn't a breakthrough. It was a signal. A text message sent moments later simply read, "It's time." The stage was set. The actors were in place. And as Cruz and Illa drove away that morning, their hearts full of joy at their daughter's apparent emotional breakthrough, they had no way of knowing they had just heard the opening lines of a horror story that would shake their community to its core. But before I tell you about the bloodshed that followed, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered how many masks a person can wear before they forget their true face? Because what happened next? Well, that's where our story turns from unsettling to truly nightmarish. Now, this is where our story turns dark. Really dark. The kind of darkness that makes you question human nature itself. Let me take you through the events of December 10th, 2021. A day that started with hope and ended in horror. 2:06 p.m. The sun hung high over the Margwood residence, casting deceptively cheerful shadows through the windows. Louis was strumming his guitar in the living room, the melody of a love song floating through the house. Gwen sat nearby, highlighting her medical textbooks, occasionally humming along. Neither noticed the shadow that passed by the window. Marlin, making his final approach. 2:15 p.m., Janice, who had been unusually quiet all morning, received a text message. Just 2 words. I'm here. She walked to her room, opened her closet, and removed the false bottom she'd crafted weeks ago. Inside lay her tools. Items collected slowly, methodically, over the past months. 2:30 p.m. The first knock at the door was so normal, so innocuous. Louis, ever the welcoming soul, set down his guitar. I'll get it, he called out, his voice carrying that characteristic warmth he was known for. The security camera would later show his last smile as he opened the door. What happened next was a symphony of violence that I'll spare you the worst details of. But know this. When Marlin entered, he wasn't alone. 2 others, their faces covered, pushed their way in. But they weren't strangers. No, they were just Marlin's friends, paid to make it look like a home invasion. Gwen, hearing her brother's sudden cry, ran into the living room, her medical textbook still clutched in her hands, highlighting markers leaving a neon streak across the floor as it fell. She fought. Oh, how she fought. The defensive wounds on her hands would later tell a story of desperate courage. 2:48 p.m. As chaos erupted downstairs, Janice sat in her room, sending that now infamous message to the family group chat. Help! Intruders in the house. But notice the timestamp. Almost 50 minutes after the initial attack began. Notice the emojis she used. The carefully crafted panic. All part of her performance. The living room, once a place of family gatherings and laughter, became a canvas of horror. The investigators would later document every detail. The shattered vases, the blood-stained baseball bat, the knife missing its handle, the overturned furniture. But what struck them most was the precision of it all. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. 3 p.m. Janice made her social media post crying for help. But here's what the public didn't know. Between her messages, she was directing traffic, telling Marlin where to move, what to take, how to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, all while listening to her siblings' final moments. The evidence would later show that Gwen's last act was trying to reach her sister's room. Her fingerprints were found on the wall leading up the stairs, as if she was trying to warn Janice, to save her. She didn't know that she was climbing towards the architect of her own destruction. 3:30 p.m. Marlin and his accomplices left, taking with them carefully selected items to support the robbery narrative. Janice waited exactly 17 minutes, counting each second, before running to the bathroom. When crews would find her later, she would be soaked from the shower, washing away any evidence, she would claim. Washing away her sins, the truth would reveal. But here's the detail that haunts me most. During the investigation, they found Janice's phone had been recording the entire time. Not for evidence, not for memory, but as a trophy. The audio file was never released to the public, but those who heard it spoke of something chilling. In the background, beneath the chaos, someone was humming a lullaby. Cruz Magwad's arrival home would mark the beginning of the next phase, the discovery. But before we get to that part of our tale, let me share something the investigators found in Janice's diary, written just hours before the attack. Today, they called me daughter. Today, I'll make sure I'm their only one. The sun was still shining when Cruz pulled into his driveway. Birds were still singing. The world outside had no idea that inside those walls, everything had changed. But that, my friends, is where our story turns even darker. The thing about truth, it's like a body in a shallow grave. No matter how well you think you've buried it, pieces always find their way to the surface. Let me tell you about the investigation that followed. Cruz's discovery of his children's bodies was just the beginning. As police tape went up around the Magwad residence, turning a home into a crime scene, investigators began to notice inconsistencies. First were the weapons: a blood-stained baseball bat, kitchen knives, a hammer, all family possessions. Strange choice for random burglars to use, wouldn't you say? Professional criminals typically bring their own tools. But these were personal weapons, chosen for their familiarity. Then there was the brutality. 51 stab wounds on Louis's body. Gwen's face deliberately mutilated. The missing ear, a trophy taken. One detective, a 20-year veteran, had to step outside when he saw the crime scene photos. "This isn't robbery," he said. "This is rage. Personal rage." But it was the bathroom that first made them suspicious. You see, when someone showers after witnessing a crime, it's usually from shock or trauma. But Janice's shower? It was methodical. The investigators found traces of blood in the drain trap. Small amounts, easily explained away. But why would an innocent witness have blood to wash off? The breakthrough came 3 days into the investigation. A local shopkeeper approached the police. He remembered something odd. A teenage boy asking directions to the Magwad house that morning. Security footage showed him clearly. Marlin carrying a backpack that would later be found empty in a ditch, save for one crucial item: Gwen's phone. But the real horror lay in the digital evidence. You see, teenagers leave breadcrumbs everywhere these days. Social media, text messages, search histories. Janice's phone, which she willingly handed over to police, thinking she'd deleted everything incriminating, became her undoing. Data recovery revealed deleted messages between her and Marlin. Plans, diagrams of the house, screenshots of family photos with 2 faces methodically crossed out. But most disturbing were the videos, dozens of them, of her practicing her panic reaction in front of her mirror. Take after take, perfecting her performance of the traumatized survivor. The investigation took another turn when Mrs. Magwad, finally allowed back into her home to collect clothes, found something in Janice's room. Hidden inside a stuffed animal, the kind no teenager would normally keep, was a journal. Not the diary of a frightened girl, but a manifesto. Pages filled with calculations, not of mathematics, but of murder. Day 73, one entry read, "They love me, but not enough. Never enough. Always them first. Gwen with her medical school dreams. Louis with his music. They don't understand. In a family, there can only be one favorite child. The final pieces came together when they found Marlin's friends, paid accomplices. They broke easily under questioning. They thought they were just helping stage a robbery, they claimed. They didn't know about the knives, the bat, the hammer. They didn't know about Janice's real plan. But here's the detail that still haunts the investigators. In Janice's room, they found a calendar. December 10th was circled in red with a simple note. Rebirth. The day she called them mom and dad wasn't a breakthrough. It was a goodbye. A cruel parody of the family moment they'd all been waiting for. The evidence mounted like shadows at sunset. Each new discovery darker than the last. But the true horror wasn't in what they found. It was in what it revealed about the human capacity for deception. About how well monsters can wear the mask of innocence. But before I tell you about the trial that followed, about how justice finally caught up with Janice and Marlin, let me share one last detail that the official reports never mentioned. In that stuffed animal, alongside the journal, they found something else. A family photo, taken just weeks before. Everyone was smiling. Everyone looked happy. But Janice had modified it, carefully cutting out every face except her own. They say the hardest part of any tragedy is the aftermath. The moment when the police tape comes down, the cameras leave, and those left behind have to somehow find a way to live with what happened. But in this case, the aftermath held horrors all its own. The trial was set for early January 2022. Due to their ages, both Janice and Marlin were tried as juveniles, a fact that would later spark public outrage. But it was during pre-trial psychological evaluation that the true depth of Janice's nature emerged. The court-appointed psychiatrist found something chilling. Not the presence of mental illness, but its absence. No trauma response. No dissociation. Just clear, calculated intent. Patient shows remarkable clarity about her actions, the report read. She speaks of the murders not with remorse or pleasure, but with the detachment of someone describing a mundane task. When asked about her motivations, she simply stated, "In nature, when resources are limited, the strongest survive." The trial itself was closed to the public, but those who were present speak of something unsettling. Throughout the proceedings, Janice maintained perfect composure, breaking character only once, when Cruz and Illa Maguad took the stand. For a brief moment, observers say, her mask slipped, revealing not anger or hatred, but something worse, satisfaction. The sentences came down like hammer blows. 10 years for assaulting Gwen, 22 years for murdering Louis. But here's where the story takes its final dark turn. The juvenile detention system, designed for rehabilitation, wasn't prepared for someone like Janice. 3 weeks into her incarceration, Illa Maguad requested a meeting with her adopted daughter. The guards would later say they tried to talk her out of it. But Illa, still searching for answers, still trying to understand, insisted. What happened in that visiting room? Well, let me share Illa's own words from her interview afterward. I looked into her eyes, searching for the girl we'd loved, the child we'd tried to save. But what looked back at me? It wasn't human. She smiled. Not her practiced perfect smile, but something else. And she said I would do it all again. Because now, you'll never forget me. The case files note that Janice keeps a calendar in her cell. Every December 10th is marked with a small star. The guards have learned not to ask why, but one reported hearing her humming on those days. The same lullaby that played in the background of her trophy recording. Cruz and Ila Maguad left their home behind, unable to live with the echoes of what happened there. The house stands empty now, though neighbors say they sometimes see lights in Janice's old room at night. Police investigations find nothing, of course, just shadows and memories. But here's the detail that haunts me most, the one I've saved for last. When they cleared out Janice's juvenile detention cell for routine inspection last month, they found something scratched into the wall behind her bed. Not a message of remorse, not a plea for forgiveness, but a simple tally mark. And next to it, in small, neat letters, "First family complete, 6 more to go." They say the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us. The ones that can smile and laugh and say, "I love you," while plotting unspeakable things. The Magwat case reminds us that sometimes the greatest horror isn't in what we can see, but in what we can't. The darkness that lives behind innocent eyes. So tonight, when you go home, when you lock your doors and check on your sleeping children, remember this. Sometimes the monsters don't hide under the bed. Sometimes they're lying in it, counting down the days until their next performance. And somewhere, in a juvenile detention center, a girl who was never really an orphan watches the calendar, plans her appeal, and waits. Because some stories, my friends, never truly end. They just wait for the next chapter.